The Earth breathes differently when you step 250 million years into the past. Here in this ancient world, the air holds a weight that feels both foreign and familiar, thick with moisture and the scent of unfamiliar growing things, while overhead the sky stretches in shades of amber and gold that our modern eyes have never quite seen. The light falls softer here, filtered through an atmosphere that seems to shimmer with possibility, and in the distance, strange forests rise like gentle giants against horizons that curve just slightly different from the ones we know. The silence is not empty but full, pregnant with the rustle of primitive ferns and the distant murmur of shallow seas that cover lands where our cities might one day stand. If you're finding peace in this journey through deep time, I'd love it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And please do share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world right now. If you'd like to support us in creating more of these gentle explorations through time, you can join as a paid member, helping us craft these calm films that carry you through the night. Now, let us walk together through this world that existed long before the first dinosaur ever drew breath, back when the Earth itself was learning how to dream. This is the late Permian period, and if we could somehow find ourselves standing in what would one day become the rolling hills near Oxford, we might meet a traveler like Thomas, a quiet observer who moves through these ancient landscapes with the patience of someone who understands that time moves differently here. Thomas walks slowly through forests of seed ferns that tower 30 feet above his head, their fronds casting patterns of light and shadow that dance across the forest floor in ways that seem almost musical. The trees here are not quite like anything we know today, though they whisper of familiar things to come, their trunks straight and strong but their leaves speaking a language that evolution has not yet finished writing. Perhaps Thomas pauses beside a stream that winds through what might one day be called Meadowbrook, watching the water carry stories from mountains that have long since worn away to sand and memory. The stream runs clear and warm, and small creatures move beneath its surface. Not quite fish as we know them, but something older, something that carries in their fins the blueprints of wings and legs and all the wonders yet to be born. The air tastes different here, richer in ways that make you want to breathe more slowly, more deeply. Scientists tell us this ancient atmosphere held nearly twice as much oxygen as our modern air, and perhaps this is why everything seems to pulse with such quiet energy, why the ferns grow so tall and the insects hum with voices that seem to come from some deeper well of life. Thomas might find himself walking beside creatures that look like strange crosses between lizards and something not yet invented, their eyes holding that particular alertness of animals who live in a world still deciding what it wants to become. These are the synapsids, the distant ancestors of all mammals, though they wear their future in scales rather than fur, and their warm blood runs beneath skin that has not yet learned the trick of growing hair to hold the heat close. The ground beneath Thomas's feet feels different too, softer perhaps, covered in mosses and small plants that seem to glow with their own inner light in the golden afternoon. There are no flowers here, not yet, for the earth has not yet dreamed up that particular burst of color and sweetness. Instead, the beauty comes in subtler forms, in the way the spore-bearing plants release their tiny passengers to dance on currents of air that smell of rain and growing things and time itself. The soil is rich and dark, built up over millions of years of fallen leaves and the patient work of creatures too small to see. And when Thomas kneels to touch it, it crumbles between his fingers like a promise of all the gardens yet to be planted. But change moves through this world like a slow river, carrying whispers of transformation on every breeze. The great ice age that has held the southern continents in its frozen grip for millions of years is beginning to loosen its hold. And with each passing season, the world grows a little warmer, a little more generous with its gifts of life. In the shallow seas that cover much of what we now call North America, strange coral reefs build themselves into underwater cities where creatures with shells like tiny spiral staircases make their homes beside others that look like flowers carved from living stone. These ancient oceans teem with life that seems almost alien to our eyes, yet carries within it the same deep rhythms that still move in the tides and seasons of our modern world. As Thomas walks through this primordial landscape, he might wonder, as we do, what it was about this particular moment in Earth's long story that made it ready to give birth to the first dinosaurs. What combination of climate and chemistry, of opportunity and accident, would soon allow those first small reptiles to step out of the forests and begin their journey toward becoming the rulers of the world? The answer lies not in any single moment but in the slow accumulation of countless small changes, each one building upon the last like layers of sediment that will one day become the rocks where we find their fossilized bones. The Earth was preparing itself, though it could not have known for what. Perhaps near the banks of another stream, this one flowing through what might someday become the valleys of Wales, Thomas encounters his companion Margaret, a fellow wanderer through these ancient lands who carries with her the same quiet wonder that draws people to walk slowly through cathedrals or stand silent beneath stars. Margaret has been following the tracks of one of those early synapsids, reading in the pressed earth the story of how it moved, where it paused to drink, how it held its head when it listened for danger in the rustling ferns. She points to a place where the mud has hardened into a perfect record of a moment 250 million years ago, and they stand together in silence, feeling the weight of all that time pressing gently down upon their shoulders like a warm blanket. The two friends continue their journey together, moving through landscapes that seem to shift and breathe around them. Here, where the forests thin and give way to open ground, they can see the great mountain ranges that rise like sleeping giants against the horizon. These mountains are older than dinosaurs, older than flowers, older than almost anything we can easily imagine. Yet they too are part of the story that is slowly unfolding around them. The rivers that flow down from their peaks carry minerals and nutrients that will feed the soils where new kinds of plants will learn to grow. And in those plants, new kinds of animals will find the food they need to experiment with different ways of being alive. The seasons here follow rhythms both familiar and strange. There is winter, yes, but it is a gentler thing than the ice ages that have shaped so much of Earth's recent history. The cold comes softly, bringing with it not the sharp bite of snow but a quieter coolness that slows the growth of plants without stopping it entirely. During these cooler months, many of the large animals move toward the equator, following the warmth in great slow migrations that carve temporary paths through forests and across rivers. In spring, they return, and with them comes an explosion of growth and renewal that fills the air with pollen and the sound of countless small creatures celebrating the return of abundance. But there are questions that hover at the edges of this peaceful scene, quiet mysteries that will take millions of years to resolve. Why are some of these early animals already beginning to grow larger while others remain small and quick? What is it about certain landscapes that seem to encourage experimentation, to call forth new shapes and new ways of moving through the world? Thomas and Margaret feel these questions in the air around them, not as urgent puzzles demanding immediate answers, but as gentle currents in the deep river of time, carrying possibilities that will only reveal themselves when the Earth is ready. As evening approaches and the light begins to fade from gold to amber to the deep blue of approaching night, our two travelers find themselves on a hill overlooking a vast plain where herds of strange creatures move like slow clouds across the grasslands that have not yet learned to grow true grass. The air is still warm, though not with the oppressive heat that will mark the great extinction event still gathering its strength in the deep places of the Earth. Instead, this is the warmth of a world at peace with itself, a world that has found, for this brief moment in geological time, a balance between all its competing forces. Here, in this gentle twilight of the Permian world, we can almost feel the future stirring in the shadows, not yet born but already dreaming of the day when small archosaurs will emerge from their hiding places in the fern forests and begin their long journey toward becoming dragons and giants, thunderous titans who will make the earth tremble beneath their feet for 160 million years. But that day is still to come, still waiting in the patient darkness of deep time. And for now, this ancient world rests in the calm before one of the greatest transformations in the history of life on Earth. But that day is still to come, still waiting in the patient darkness of deep time. And for now, this ancient world rests in the calm before one of the greatest transformations in the history of life on Earth. Though perhaps in the way the wind shifts through the fern groves near Oxford, carrying scents that seem both familiar and strange, we can sense that something vast and quiet is preparing to unfold. The season has turned toward what we might call early autumn, though the words feel different when applied to a world that has never known the particular gold of maple leaves or the sharp sweetness of apples ripening in October sun. Instead, this ancient autumn brings its own gifts, a softening of the light that filters through the canopy of seed ferns and primitive conifers, casting everything in shades of amber and bronze that seem to glow from within. The air moves differently now, carrying on its currents the spores of countless plants that have been experimenting with new ways of spreading their offspring across the vast continental masses that drift slowly across the face of the earth like sleeping leviathans. Thomas finds himself drawn again and again to a particular grove near what we have come to call Meadowbrook, where the ancient stream winds between stands of glossopteris trees, their tongue-shaped leaves rustling with a sound like whispered secrets. He has been making quiet observations here for what feels like seasons, though time moves strangely in this place where a million years passes like a single breath. In his weathered journal, bound in something that might once have been the hide of a long-vanished creature, he sketches the delicate patterns of fern fronds and notes the way certain rocks seem to hold the memory of shells and strange spiraled creatures that lived when this land lay beneath warm, shallow seas. The pages of his journal are filled with questions written in fading ink, wondering about the small changes he observes from day to day, the way certain plants seem to be growing taller, the way some of the reptilian creatures appear to be holding their legs differently, as though they are learning to carry their bodies in ways that speak of journeys not yet taken. Margaret has established her own quiet vigil near the banks of another stream, this one flowing through what might someday become the gentle valleys that roll between Oxford and the Welsh borderlands. She sits often on a boulder of red sandstone that the water has polished smooth over countless seasons, watching the interplay of current and stone, of light and shadow, as though she might read in these eternal patterns some hint of the changes that move like slow music through the very bones of the earth. Her notes, written on thin sheets of bark that she prepares with the patience of someone who understands that lasting things require time, record the subtle shifts in the behavior of the creatures that come to drink at the water's edge. She has noticed that some of the larger synapsids seem to be spending more time upright, their powerful hindquarters suggesting possibilities that evolution has not yet fully explored, while smaller creatures dart between their feet with an agility that speaks of adaptations still being written in flesh and bone. The quality of light in this ancient world continues to fascinate both observers, though they lack the words to describe what makes it so different from any illumination they have ever known. Perhaps it is the way the atmosphere itself seems to shimmer with possibilities, thick enough with oxygen that every breath feels like drinking from some deep well of energy, yet soft enough that the sun's rays fall with a gentleness that makes everything appear touched by dreams. The shadows beneath the great fern trees are not dark but filled with a green luminescence that seems to pulse with the slow heartbeat of growing things. While in the open spaces, where primitive conifers stretch their branches toward the amber sky, the light pools like honey among the fallen needles and strange, small flowers that have not yet learned to bloom in colors bright enough to attract the insects that do not yet exist to pollinate them. Water moves everywhere in this landscape, not just in the obvious streams and rivers but seeping up through the rich soil, condensing from the humid air onto every surface, creating a world where the boundary between liquid and vapor seems negotiable, subject to revision. Thomas often finds himself pausing beside pools that have formed in the hollows of ancient tree roots, watching the way small creatures move beneath the surface like living jewels, their scales catching and refracting light in patterns that seem almost too beautiful to have evolved by chance. These pools serve as windows into an underwater world that teems with forms of life that seem to exist at the very edge of becoming something else. Primitive fish that hover on the boundary between swimming and something that might one day be called walking, their fins already beginning to suggest the architecture of limbs. The texture of surfaces in this world carries its own quiet poetry, from the soft give of moss beneath bare feet to the rougher grain of tree bark that feels almost alive beneath exploring fingers. Margaret has developed the habit of touching different stones, noting in her bark paper journal the way some seem to hold warmth long after the sun has passed behind clouds, while others remain cool even on the warmest days, as though they remember the ice ages that have shaped so much of Earth's recent history. The soil itself varies from place to place, sometimes sandy and loose beneath the great forests, sometimes clay-rich and dense near the stream banks, but everywhere rich with the accumulated gifts of millions of years of patient decomposition, layer upon layer of fallen leaves and the shells of tiny creatures building the foundation upon which all future gardens will grow. The creatures that share this landscape with Thomas and Margaret move with a deliberation that speaks of a world where haste has not yet been invented, where every action seems considered against the vast backdrop of geological time. Near the stream that flows past Oxford, Thomas has been observing a particular individual, a large synapsid that he has come to think of as the Wanderer, whose daily routine involves a slow circuit between several favored feeding grounds, pausing often to test the air with delicate movements of its head, as though it can sense changes that remain invisible to less sensitive observers. The wanderer's tracks in the soft earth beside the water tell stories of a creature caught between worlds, its gait suggesting the reptilian sprawl of its ancestors while hinting at the more upright posture that some of its descendants will one day perfect. But it is perhaps in the smaller details that the true nature of this pivotal moment in Earth's history reveals itself most clearly. In the way certain ferns have begun to experiment with tougher, more weatherproof fronds, or how some of the primitive conifers seem to be developing more efficient ways of protecting their seeds during the long journeys between one suitable growing site and the next. Margaret has documented what appears to be the emergence of entirely new forms of cooperation between different species, noting places where certain plants seem to grow more vigorously in the presence of specific types of fungi, their roots intertwining in networks that suggest communication systems more sophisticated than anything previously imagined. These observations fill her bark paper pages with diagrams and questions, sketches of root systems that look almost like primitive nervous systems, and notes about the way information seems to flow through these underground networks like slow thoughts in some vast, distributed mind. The stars that will overhead in this ancient sky tell their own version of the story, though their patterns remain largely unchanged from the configurations that will one day guide human navigators across unknown seas. Thomas and Margaret often find themselves sitting together beside their respective streams as darkness falls, watching the familiar constellations emerge in the clear air above them, finding comfort in this one constant in a world where everything else seems poised on the edge of transformation. The night sounds here are different from any they have known, filled with the calls of creatures that exist nowhere else in time, voices that speak in frequencies that seem to resonate with something deep in the bones of anyone patient enough to listen. Yet beneath all this peaceful observation, both Thomas and Margaret sense something stirring in the deep foundations of the world, something that expresses itself not in sudden changes, but in the gradual acceleration of processes that have been building for millions of years. The very rocks beneath their feet seem to whisper of pressures accumulating in the Earth's deep places, of chemical changes brewing in ocean depths and volcanic systems that stretch their influence across entire continents. The balance that has allowed this Permian world to flourish in such quiet abundance may be more fragile than it appears, held in place by forces that even now are beginning to shift toward configurations that will remake the face of the planet. In the warm evenings, when the air grows thick with the scent of spores and the distant sound of creatures calling to one another across vast distances, Thomas and Margaret sometimes find themselves drawn to the same hilltop overlooking the plains where those great herds move like slow thoughts across the landscape. From this vantage point, they can see how the very shape of the land seems to be changing, how rivers are carving new channels, and how the forests are expanding into territories that were once too dry or too cold to support such abundance. These changes happen too slowly for any single lifetime to witness, yet they leave their marks in the stone and soil for anyone who knows how to read the patient script that time writes across the surface of the world. As the season deepens toward whatever passes for winter in this ancient climate, both observers notice that their journals are filling with references to transitions, to creatures and plants that seem to be testing new possibilities, to small experiments in form and function that hint at innovations still generations away from full expression. The world around them pulses with potential energy, like a held breath or a wave gathering itself before breaking upon some distant shore. And in the quality of light that falls through the ancient forests, in the way the wind moves through leaves that have never known frost, in the patient work of roots and fungi building networks beneath the surface of the visible world, something new is beginning to stir. The seasonal shift to autumn and the descriptions of light, texture, and the patient work of observation all contribute to that sleepy, immersive quality while gradually opening up the historical context of this pivotal moment before the first dinosaurs appeared. And as the days grow shorter in this ancient world, Thomas finds himself returning often to his earlier notes, pages that have grown soft and worn from handling, their edges curled like autumn leaves ready to release their stories to the wind. His handwriting from seasons past looks different now. The ink faded to the color of old tea, and he traces the lines with one finger as though he might absorb through touch what time has begun to blur. Here on a page dated to what he thinks was early spring, he had sketched a small creature with legs that seemed caught between sprawling and standing, its posture suggesting something that evolution had not yet decided how to finish. And now, comparing that sketch to more recent observations, He wonders if he might have witnessed one of those quiet moments when life experiments with new ways of being in the world. Margaret has spread her collection of bark paper notes across the smooth surface of her favorite red sandstone boulder, arranging them like pieces of a vast puzzle that may never have a final picture. The late afternoon light slants across the pages, illuminating her careful drawings of root systems and fungal networks, her measurements of seasonal water levels, her detailed observations of how certain creatures seem to gather at specific times of day near particular types of stones. She has begun to notice patterns that stretch across her months of watching, connections between the behavior of the soil organisms she cannot see and the health of the plants that grow above them, relationships that speak of communication systems older than any language yet invented. Her fingertip follows the branching diagrams she has drawn of what lies beneath the surface, pathways that connect tree to tree across distances that would take a careful walker most of a day to cross. And she wonders what messages might flow along these hidden highways, what ancient conversations take place in the slow vocabulary of chemistry and shared nutrients. The quality of light at this time of day carries its own quiet wisdom, neither the bright clarity of morning nor the golden warmth of full afternoon, but something softer, more forgiving, that seems to reveal textures and relationships that harsher illumination might hide. Thomas often chooses this hour to examine the small samples he has collected, fragments of stone and fossilized wood, tiny shells that must have belonged to creatures that lived when this land lay beneath warm seas, pressing each specimen between his palms to feel its weight and temperature, as though these physical qualities might speak more directly than any scientific analysis. There is something in the way these ancient materials warm to his touch that suggests they have been waiting all this time to tell their stories, patient as only stones can be patient, holding their secrets until someone takes the time to listen properly. The maps that Margaret has been drawing on the inside bark of fallen trees show a landscape that seems both perfectly familiar and subtly strange, as though she were documenting a world that exists just slightly to the side of the one she knows. Her careful notations mark the locations where she has observed the most interesting behaviors, the clearings where certain creatures seem to gather for purposes she cannot quite understand, the particular bends and streams where unusual plants have established themselves in configurations that suggest some deeper logic than mere chance. She has begun to suspect that there are patterns here that operate on scales of time and space larger than any single observer could hope to encompass, connections that might only become visible to someone who could watch this landscape for centuries, noting the slow migrations of forests and the even slower conversations between geology and biology. As the shadows lengthen and the air takes on that particular stillness that comes just before evening, Thomas finds himself drawn once again to a section of his journal where he had attempted to describe a sound he had heard one morning near Meadowbrook, a low harmonic that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising and falling like the breathing of some vast creature that stretched far beyond the boundaries of his vision. He had written then that it reminded him of the way water sounds when it moves through limestone caves, a resonance that speaks of hidden spaces and patient processes. But reading those words now, he wonders if he had been hearing something even more fundamental, the actual voice of transformation as it worked its slow changes in the deep places where root systems meet geological structures, meet the vast networks of soil organisms that may form the true nervous system of this living world. The soil beneath their feet tells its own complex story, built layer by careful layer from the accumulated gifts of countless seasons, fallen leaves that have given up their green for the service of future growth, the shells and bones of creatures whose lives have become the foundation for everything that follows. Margaret often kneels beside her stream to examine the way different types of earth have settled into distinct bands, each one representing perhaps thousands of years of steady accumulation, the patient work of rain and wind and the small creatures that spend their lives moving particles from one place to another. Her fingers trace these geological layers as though they were lines of text in some ancient book, and she wonders what stories they might tell to someone who had learned to read the language of sedimentation and mineral exchange. The water that flows past their observation points carries more than moisture and dissolved nutrients, more than the seeds and spores that will establish new colonies of life in distant valleys. It carries memory, the chemical signatures of every landscape it has touched, every rock formation it has dissolved grain by microscopic grain, every root system that has drawn sustenance from its passing presence. Thomas has developed the habit of cupping his hands in the stream that flows near Oxford, not to drink but to feel the slight variations in temperature that speak of underground springs and hidden tributaries, the complex geography that exists beneath the surface of the visible world. The water tastes different each day, sometimes carrying the metallic tang of mineral-rich stones, sometimes touched with the sweetness of decomposing plant matter, each flavor a report from regions he will never see but that nonetheless shape the character of everything he observes. The creatures that share this landscape continue their daily routines with a deliberation that suggests they too are engaged in some form of observation, some patient gathering of information that operates on timescales vastly different from those that govern Thomas and Margaret's more hurried human investigations. That large synapsid that Thomas has come to call the Wanderer maintains its slow circuit between feeding grounds, but its pauses have grown longer, its attention more focused on things that remain invisible to less sensitive observers. Sometimes it stands motionless for what seems like hours beside particular trees or rock formations, its powerful body perfectly still except for the slight movements of its head that suggest it is testing currents of air or sound that carry information in frequencies beyond human perception. The fading light reveals colors that seem to exist nowhere else in time, subtle variations of green and brown and gold that speak of chemical processes not quite the same as those that will one day paint the leaves of oak and maple trees. Margaret has tried repeatedly to capture these hues in her bark paper journals, mixing pigments from clay and crushed berries and the soft inner bark of certain trees, but always the colors seem to slip away from her, as though they belong too completely to this particular moment in Earth's history to be preserved by any artificial means. She has begun to suspect that what she is seeing represents not just different wavelengths of reflected light but different relationships between living things and the energy that flows between them, partnerships between plant and fungus and soil organism that create their own unique signatures in the visible spectrum. The evening sounds that begin to emerge as darkness approaches carry their own quiet mysteries, calls and responses that seem to follow patterns more complex than simple territorial announcements or mating displays. Thomas has spent entire nights sitting beside his favorite observation point, listening to the way these voices weave together into something that resembles music more than random noise. Harmonies that rise and fall with the phases of the moon and the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that predict weather patterns days in advance. He has begun to wonder if these creatures might be participating in some form of collective awareness, sharing information across species boundaries in ways that later forms of life will forget how to access, communication systems that operate through sound and scent and perhaps other channels that evolution has not yet taught humans to perceive. But it is in the small details, the observations that fill the margins of their journals and the spaces between more obvious discoveries, that Thomas and Margaret find themselves returning again and again to questions that seem to have no clear answers. Why do certain combinations of plants and animals thrive in some locations while identical combinations fail completely in apparently similar environments? What determines the invisible boundaries that some creatures never seem to cross, while others move freely through territories that span entire watersheds? There are patterns here that suggest influences operating on scales both much larger and much smaller than anything they can directly observe, connections between the behavior of individual organisms and forces that operate across continents and geological ages. The samples that Thomas has collected over his months of observation form their own silent archive, each fragment of stone or fossilized wood or crystallized mineral carrying within its structure the memory of conditions that existed millions of years before any observer arrived to witness them. He arranges these specimens according to various systems, sometimes by location, sometimes by apparent age, sometimes by the circumstances under which he found them, but always with the sense that their true relationships remain hidden, waiting for some insight that has not yet occurred to him. Each piece seems to suggest connections to the others, chemical similarities or structural patterns that hint at underlying processes too vast and slow to be grasped by any intelligence that operates on the brief timescales of biological life. As the last light fades from the western sky and the first stars begin to appear in the clear air above them, Thomas and Margaret often find themselves drawn to the same questions that have haunted observers throughout human history, questions about the nature of change and continuity, about the relationship between the patterns they can see and the forces they can only infer from their effects. The world around them pulses with quiet activity, roots extending through soil, fungi extending their networks through fallen logs, water slowly wearing stone into new configurations, and they sense that they are witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when the Earth's experimentation with different forms of life is approaching some kind of threshold, though neither the nature of that threshold nor its consequences remain clear to them in this peaceful hour when even time itself seems to move more slowly. The atmosphere remains calm and safe for sleep listening, with no dramatic revelations or strong claims, just the patient accumulation of small observations that hint at larger mysteries. And it is on one particular morning, when the mist rises from the stream near Meadowbrook in threads so fine they seem woven from light itself, that Thomas notices something different about the way his footsteps sound against the earth. The ground beneath his familiar path has changed, not dramatically but in some subtle way that speaks to his feet before his mind can process what has shifted. A firmness where there once was give, a dryness where moisture had pooled for as long as he has been walking this route. The air carries a different weight this morning, thinner somehow, as though some invisible presence that had always been there has begun to withdraw, leaving behind spaces that the atmosphere has not yet learned to fill. When he kneels to press his palm against the soil, it feels cooler than it should, considering the warmth of the early sun that filters through the canopy above, and there is something in its texture that reminds him of sand that has been too long without rain. Margaret feels the change too, though it manifests differently at her observation point beside the red sandstone boulder that has become her outdoor desk. The water level in her stream has dropped perhaps half the width of her palm since yesterday. Not enough to alarm, but sufficient to expose sections of the streambed that have remained hidden throughout all her months of watching. These newly revealed stones show patterns that speak of different times, different flows, their surfaces marked with the delicate tracery that moving water leaves when it has years rather than seasons to write its stories in mineral and sediment. She runs her fingers along these exposed surfaces, feeling the microscopic ridges and valleys that chart the patient work of countless small currents. And she wonders how long these stones have waited beneath the water for their turn in the sun, what secrets they might reveal about the deeper rhythms that govern this landscape. The quality of light this morning carries an unusual clarity, as though the air itself has been washed clean by some process that operates beyond the reach of ordinary weather. Thomas finds that he can see farther into the forest than usual, deeper into the spaces between the great fern trees where shadows normally pool like dark water. The familiar landmarks of his daily route appear somehow more defined, their edges sharper, their textures more pronounced, as though the world has shifted into a slightly different focus that reveals details previously hidden by the softer light of more humid days. Even the colors seem different, the greens more intense but also more fragile, as though they might fade if observed too closely or if this new clarity of air persists much longer than the forest is accustomed to bearing. The creatures that Thomas and Margaret have grown used to observing seem to sense these changes in ways that their human awareness can only approximate. The large synapsid that Thomas calls the Wanderer has altered its routine, spending longer periods motionless beside the stream, its powerful head lifted as though it listens to frequencies that have not been present in the air before. Its breathing appears more deliberate, each inhalation and exhalation measured against some internal rhythm that may be adjusting to accommodate atmospheric conditions that evolution has not previously required it to navigate. When it does move, its gait seems more careful, each step tested against ground that may no longer offer the same reliable support that has shaped its movements for generations. The smaller creatures display their own forms of adaptation to these subtle but persistent changes in their environment. Margaret has noticed that many of the insects and tiny reptiles that usually move freely between her observation areas have begun to cluster around the remaining pools of moisture, as though they sense that water itself has become more precious than it was even a week ago. Their behavior suggests an awareness that operates on timescales both much faster and much more intuitive than human observation, an ability to detect and respond to environmental shifts that may still be too gradual for conscious human minds to fully grasp, but that nonetheless register in the deep places where instinct and survival intersect with the patient wisdom of evolutionary experience. The soil beneath the great forests tells its own version of this unfolding story, revealing changes that speak to processes operating far below the surface of immediate observation. When Thomas kneels to examine the earth around the base of a particularly ancient fern tree, he finds that what had been soft and spongy with moisture now crumbles between his fingers with a dryness that seems to come not just from the absence of recent rain, but from some deeper withdrawal of the water that normally rises from underground sources to maintain the forest's green abundance. The root systems that he can glimpse in the small excavations he makes with careful hands appear to be reaching deeper than he has observed before, their pale tendrils extending downward in search of moisture that may have retreated to levels not accessed since the last major climate shift reshaped this continent's relationship with rainfall and temperature. Margaret's stream continues to reveal new sections of its bed, as the water level drops by increments so small that only the most patient observation could detect them. The stones that emerge from their watery concealment show surfaces polished by currents that may have flowed here for thousands of years, their shapes speaking of forces that work on scales of time that make human lifespans seem like the brief flutter of leaves in an afternoon breeze. Some of these newly exposed rocks bear the fossilized impressions of creatures that lived when this landscape existed under different skies, their shells and segments preserved in mineral form that allows them to continue their ancient conversation with light and air and the careful attention of observers who may be among the last to witness their patient testimony. The temperature of both air and water seems to fluctuate in patterns that do not match the familiar rhythms of season and weather that Thomas and Margaret have learned to expect from their months of observation. The warmth that rises from the Earth in the early morning feels less generous, as though the planet's internal fires have banked themselves against some approaching change that requires conservation of energy. The streams that had maintained their warm flow even during the coolest nights now carry currents that speak of deeper, colder sources, water that may have traveled farther or taken longer to reach the surface than the springs that had previously fed these valleys with such reliable abundance. The sounds of this changing world carry their own quiet revelations, subtle alterations in the acoustic landscape that suggest transformations occurring at frequencies both above and below the range of normal human hearing. The calls of creatures that had filled the evening air with such reliable harmony now seem more scattered, as though the singers themselves are uncertain about the acoustic properties of air that has grown thinner and drier than their voices evolved to navigate. Thomas often finds himself straining to hear sounds that seem to hover just at the edge of perception, low-frequency vibrations that may be rising from the Earth itself as geological processes that normally operate in silence begin to express themselves in ways that sensitive ears might detect. The way shadows fall across the landscape has subtly shifted, not because the sun follows a different path, but because the air through which its light travels no longer bends and filters illumination in quite the same manner as before. Margaret notices that her shadow appears sharper at certain times of day, its edges more defined against surfaces that previously would have softened such stark contrasts with the gentle blur that humid air lends to all visual boundaries. This increased clarity brings its own form of beauty, but also a quality of exposure that makes everything seem more vulnerable, as though the protective softness that had wrapped this world in forgiving light has begun to withdraw, leaving landscapes and creatures alike more visible, more present, but also more subject to the kind of scrutiny that gentle climates help living things avoid. The minerals that Thomas collects during his daily wanderings show changes that speak to chemical processes accelerating beneath the surface of visible events. Crystals that he finds in the exposed sections of streambed appear more concentrated, their structures more defined, as though the solutions from which they precipitated have grown more intense as the water that normally dilutes such processes has become less available. The colors of these mineral formations seem brighter, more saturated, but also somehow more fragile, as though they represent the concentrated essence of processes that previously had the luxury of operating at more relaxed concentrations, with more time and more abundant solvents to achieve their crystalline perfection. But perhaps the most significant change reveals itself not in any single observation but in the accumulation of countless small alterations that together suggest forces operating on scales that dwarf the comfortable rhythms of daily weather and seasonal progression. The very air seems to vibrate with potential energy, not the restless energy of approaching storms but something deeper and more patient, the kind of power that builds in geological structures over periods measured in millions of years before expressing itself in transformations that reshape continents and redirect the course of evolutionary experimentation. Thomas and Margaret find themselves moving more slowly through their familiar landscapes, not from fatigue but from a growing awareness that they may be witnessing the kind of changes that occur perhaps once in the history of a planet, moments when the Earth itself crosses thresholds that separate one era from another. The starlight that illuminates their evening observations seems to fall through air that offers less resistance than before, creating a clarity of night vision that allows them to see details in the landscape that had previously remained hidden in the softer darkness of more humid evenings. This enhanced visibility brings with it a sense of exposure that feels both exhilarating and somehow precarious, as though the protective veils that normally wrap the world in gentle mystery have grown thin enough to reveal structures and relationships that perhaps were meant to remain hidden from the eyes of creatures whose understanding operates on such brief timescales compared to the patient processes that shape mountains and redirect rivers and determine which experiments in living will be allowed to continue their exploration of possibility. As they sit together on the hill overlooking the plains where those great herds continue their slow movements across grasslands that may be preparing to transform into something entirely different, Thomas and Margaret find themselves contemplating questions that seem to grow larger rather than smaller as their observations accumulate. What they are witnessing may represent the end of one chapter in Earth's long story and the beginning of another, but the nature of that transition remains as mysterious as the forces that have set it in motion, and they wonder whether the changes they observe represent the slow crescendo towards some climactic event, or whether they are already living through the transformation itself, too close to its unfolding to recognize the magnitude of what surrounds them in each breath of increasingly precious air, each step across ground that grows more solid and less forgiving with each passing day, each moment of startling clarity that seems to strip away the comfortable veils of mystery that had previously made this ancient world feel so welcoming to observers who thought they understood the rhythms by which life and landscape negotiate their eternal partnership. And in the growing silence that seems to press against their ears like the weight of vast spaces opening between earth and sky, they begin to sense that they stand at the threshold of discovering not just what this world was becoming, but what it was preparing to leave behind forever. The section ends with an open question about whether they're witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another, setting up the major reveal while keeping everything humble and uncertain. And in the days that follow this growing awareness of change, Thomas finds himself drawn to collect samples from places he had previously overlooked, fragments of stone from the deeper layers that erosion has begun to expose along the banks of Meadowbrook, pieces of fossilized wood that seem to carry within their petrified grain the memory of atmospheric conditions that may no longer exist anywhere on Earth. His fingers trace the patterns preserved in these ancient materials, feeling textures that speak of trees that grew under skies with different chemical compositions, in soils that received rainfall measured in rhythms that no living forest has experienced for millions of years. Each specimen he gathers seems to whisper of connections that hover just beyond the reach of his understanding, relationships between past and present that might reveal themselves to someone with more time, more patience, more knowledge of the deep languages that rocks and minerals use to record the conversations between earth and sky. Margaret has begun to map the changes in her stream with a precision that borders on meditation, marking each day's water level with small cairns of pale stones that catch the light like waypoints along a route that leads towards some destination she cannot yet name. The pattern that emerges from these markers suggests cycles within cycles, fluctuations that seem to respond not just to immediate weather but to forces that operate on scales she can feel but cannot measure, influences that reach into this quiet valley from places as distant as the great mountain ranges that rim the horizon and the vast ice sheets that still grip the southern continents in their slow embrace. Her notes, written on bark paper pages that grow more precious as the materials to make them become harder to find, record temperatures and flow rates, and the subtle changes in the mineral content of water that tastes different each morning, carrying new stories from the underground regions where springs are born. The quality of light continues to evolve in ways that neither observer can quite quantify, shifting toward clarities that reveal details previously hidden while somehow making other familiar sights appear strange and newly mysterious. Thomas often pauses during his early morning walks to study the way shadows fall across surfaces that he has observed for months, noting how the same stones and tree trunks now cast patterns that seem sharper, more defined, as though the air itself has gained the ability to hold edges and boundaries with greater precision. The colors that emerge in this changing illumination appear both more vivid and more fragile. Greens that glow with an intensity that seems almost artificial, browns and golds that pulse with their own inner light, but always with an underlying quality that suggests impermanence, as though these enhanced hues represent the last brilliant expression of a world that may soon learn to paint itself in entirely different palettes. The creatures that share this landscape display their own forms of adaptation to conditions that seem to shift with each passing day, adjustments so gradual that only the most careful observation can detect them, but so persistent that their cumulative effect suggests transformations that may be approaching some critical threshold. The large synapsid that Thomas calls the Wanderer has begun to spend longer periods motionless beside the stream, but its stillness now carries a quality of intense attention rather than mere rest, as though it listens to frequencies that grow more urgent with each day that brings less moisture to the air and less abundance to the forest floor. Its breathing has taken on a rhythm that seems calculated to extract maximum benefit from atmospheric conditions that may be testing the limits of respiratory systems evolved for a more generous climate. But it is in the smaller details that the true nature of these changes begins to reveal itself most clearly, in observations that accumulate like sediment in the quiet pools of consciousness where pattern recognition operates below the threshold of conscious thought. Margaret has noticed that certain types of plants seem to be concentrating their energy in ways that speak of preparation for conditions that have not yet fully manifested, developing thicker protective coatings on their leaves, sending roots deeper into soil layers that had previously provided sufficient moisture closer to the surface, producing seeds that carry larger stores of nutrients than would seem necessary for the current environment but that might prove essential for survival in a world growing gradually but persistently less hospitable to the forms of life that had flourished here for millions of years. The soil itself tells increasingly complex stories to anyone with the patience to read the subtle changes in its composition and behavior, revealing chemical processes that suggest accelerating transformations in the deep places where geology and biology meet and negotiate the terms of their ancient partnership. When Thomas kneels to examine the earth around the bases of the great fern trees, he finds layers that seem to be compacting more rapidly than seasonal variations would normally produce, as though the very foundation of the forest ecosystem has begun to consolidate itself against pressures that approach from directions his surface observations cannot yet identify. The root systems that he can glimpse in his careful excavations appear to be reorganizing themselves, forming networks that seem designed for more efficient resource sharing, as though the underground community of plants and fungi has begun to operate under protocols evolved for scarcity rather than abundance. The minerals that emerge from the exposed sections of streambed continue to display characteristics that speak of concentration and intensification, crystals that form with structures more complex and more highly organized than the casual precipitation that normally occurs when water carries dissolved substances across landscapes blessed with reliable moisture and moderate temperatures. Margaret has collected samples that seem to capture in their geometric arrangements the story of chemical processes operating under increasing pressure, formations that suggest solutions growing more concentrated as the solvents that normally dilute such interactions become less available to moderate the intensity of mineral exchanges. These specimens catch light in ways that seem almost alive, refracting illumination through faceted surfaces that break ordinary sunlight into spectra that hint at wavelengths normally hidden from unassisted observation. The temperature patterns that govern daily life in this changing world follow rhythms that seem to operate according to rules that neither Thomas nor Margaret can fully decode, fluctuations that suggest influences reaching into their quiet valleys from regions and processes that dwarf the local weather systems they had learned to read during their months of patient observation. The warmth that rises from the earth each morning carries less generosity than before, while the coolness that settles during evening hours seems to penetrate more deeply into surfaces that had previously held their heat well into the night. Water temperatures in both their streams follow curves that speak of sources growing more distant or more deeply buried, as though the springs that feed these waterways have begun to draw from reserves that require more energy to access, more time to replenish. The acoustic landscape of their world continues to evolve in ways that register more clearly in feeling than in conscious hearing, subtle alterations in the way sound travels through air that has grown thinner and drier, changes in the resonance that different surfaces offer to the calls and movements of creatures whose voices may be adapting to atmospheric conditions that their evolutionary programming has never previously encountered. Thomas often finds himself listening not just to the sounds that fill the air but to the quality of silence between those sounds, spaces that seem larger now, more echoing, as though the world itself has begun to hollow out in ways that create new chambers for sound to explore, but that also suggest absences where abundance once provided a different kind of acoustic richness. But perhaps the most significant changes reveal themselves in the patterns that emerge when individual observations combine across time and space, forming pictures that suggest processes operating on scales that individual consciousness can sense but not directly comprehend. Margaret has begun to notice that her daily measurements, when arranged according to various systems of organization, reveal cycles within cycles, rhythms that seem to respond to influences as local as the phase of the moon and as distant as the slow drift of continents across the face of the planet. Her bark paper charts, spread across the red sandstone surface of her outdoor desk, create maps of change that seem to point toward something approaching, some convergence of forces that operates according to schedules measured in geological rather than biological time. The way shadows move across familiar landscapes has subtly shifted, not because the sun follows a different path, but because the air through which light travels no longer bends and filters illumination in quite the same patterns as before, creating visual effects that make even well-known landmarks appear somehow foreign. as though they belong to a world that exists just slightly to the side of the one Thomas and Margaret thought they understood. Colors seem both more saturated and more ephemeral, textures more defined but also more vulnerable to changes in viewing angle and atmospheric density, giving the entire visible world a quality that hovers between enhanced clarity and fundamental instability. The creatures they observe continue their daily routines, but with modifications so gradual that only the most dedicated attention can detect them. Adaptations that suggest responses to environmental pressures that build so slowly that they remain below the threshold of alarm, while nonetheless requiring adjustments that may be pushing various species toward the limits of their physiological flexibility. The smaller animals that depend on surface moisture for much of their hydration have begun to cluster around the remaining reliable water sources, creating temporary communities that cross normal territorial boundaries and species barriers, as though survival itself has begun to require new forms of cooperation that evolution had not previously had occasion to develop. Yet beneath all these observable changes, both Thomas and Margaret sense something larger stirring, forces that operate on scales and according to principles that their human awareness can detect only as a persistent feeling that the world around them stands poised at the edge of transformation more profound than any seasonal shift or normal climatic variation could produce. The very air seems to vibrate with potential energy that builds like charge before lightning, though what it might discharge into remains as mysterious as the sources from which it draws its slowly accumulating power. Their journals fill with questions that seem to multiply rather than resolve as their observations become more detailed and their measurements more precise. Patterns that suggest connections between local changes and planetary processes too vast and too patient for any single lifetime to encompass. As they sit together on their familiar hill overlooking the plains where those great herds continue their slow movements across landscapes that seem each day less stable and more provisional, Thomas and Margaret find themselves contemplating the possibility that they stand witness to something unprecedented in the history of Earth's experiments with life, a moment when the planet's long exploration of different possibilities for biological organization approaches some kind of threshold beyond, which entirely new forms of existence might become not just possible but necessary. And in the growing intensity of starlight that falls through air too thin to soften its ancient brilliance, they sense that whatever approaches may arrive not as catastrophe but as opportunity, though for what kinds of life and under what conditions remains a question that hangs in the crystalline air like a promise that only time itself has the authority to fulfill. The section ends with the feeling that they're witnessing something unprecedented in Earth's history, a planetary threshold where new forms of existence might become necessary. And it is on a morning when the mist rises from Meadowbrook in spirals so thin they seem like visible thoughts that Thomas makes a discovery that changes the nature of all his previous observations. Beneath a fallen log that erosion has shifted during the night, he finds impressions in the mud that speak of feet unlike any he has seen in all his months of careful tracking, marks that suggest a creature that moved with its body held high above the ground, its legs positioned directly beneath its torso in a way that seems to defy the sprawling gait that characterizes every large animal he has previously encountered. The tracks are small, no larger than his own palm, but they carry within their preserved outline the suggestion of changes in locomotion that could reshape the very relationship between Earth and the creatures that move across its surface. Margaret discovers her own revelation beside the red sandstone boulder where she has maintained her vigil over the slowly dropping stream, finding among the newly exposed stones several specimens that bear the fossilized remains of shells arranged in patterns that speak of underwater environments vastly different from any current ocean. These ancient seafloors, now lifted high above any existing water level, preserve in their mineral matrix the evidence of life forms that existed when the chemistry of Earth's waters followed different rules, when the balance between acid and alkaline allowed creatures to build protective homes from materials that modern seas could no longer support. The shells show structures more complex than anything living in contemporary waters, spiral arrangements that suggest mathematical relationships between growth and environment that evolution seems to have abandoned in favor of simpler, more adaptable designs. But perhaps the most significant discovery emerges not from any single observation but from the slow recognition that the changes they have been documenting may represent not the end of current patterns but the beginning of something entirely unprecedented in the long history of life on Earth. Thomas finds himself returning again and again to his sketches of that large synapsid he calls the Wanderer, comparing recent drawings with observations made months earlier, and he begins to see subtle alterations in posture and movement that suggest this creature may be experimenting with new ways of carrying its body through space. The powerful hindquarters that had always impressed him now seemed to be taking on greater importance in locomotion, while the front limbs appeared to be developing a more supportive rather than propulsive role, as though evolution itself has begun to test the advantages of redistributing weight and balance in configurations that no previous generation of land animals has ever attempted. The quality of light that illuminates these discoveries carries its own revelations, falling through air that seems increasingly transparent to wavelengths that had previously been filtered out by the moisture and particulates that once gave this world its softer, more forgiving visual character. In this enhanced clarity, Margaret can see details in the exposed rock layers that speak of multiple periods when sea levels rose and fell according to cycles that operated on timescales measured in millions of years, each transgression and regression leaving its signature in the types of sediment deposited and the kinds of life forms that thrived during those ancient epochs. The patterns she traces with her fingers suggest that the current changes may be part of a vast rhythm that encompasses not just climate and weather, but the very architecture of continents and ocean basins. The samples that Thomas has collected over his months of observation begin to tell a more coherent story when arranged according to the new organizing principles that his recent discoveries suggest, revealing relationships between mineral composition and biological activity that speak of ecosystem changes operating on scales that dwarf the seasonal variations he had initially assumed were governing the transformations he witnessed. Certain crystalline formations appear only in association with specific types of organic matter, suggesting chemical partnerships between living and non-living systems that may be essential for maintaining the conditions that allow complex life to flourish, but that may also be vulnerable to disruption when environmental parameters shift beyond the narrow ranges that such delicate collaborations require to maintain their stability. Margaret's measurements of stream flow and temperature variations, when plotted against the phases of the moon and the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that her increasingly sensitive observations have learned to detect, reveal cycles within cycles that suggest influences reaching into her quiet valley from processes as local as the underground water table and as distant as the slow warming of polar regions where ice sheets that have dominated the planet's climate for millions of years may be beginning their gradual retreat toward configurations that will allow entirely different weather patterns to establish themselves across the face of the Earth. Her bark paper charts create maps of interconnection that seem to trace the circulation of energy and materials through systems so vast and so complex that individual consciousness can grasp only fragments of their operation. The creatures that share this landscape continue to display adaptations that speak of environmental pressures building toward some critical threshold, but their responses now seem less like random adjustments to changing conditions and more like coordinated preparation for circumstances that have not yet fully manifested but that may require entirely new strategies for survival and reproduction. The smaller animals that Thomas observes near Oxford have begun to exhibit behaviors that suggest increased cooperation across species boundaries, sharing information about food sources and water availability in ways that transcend the normal territorial instincts that had previously governed their interactions, as though survival itself has begun to require forms of collective intelligence that individual species had never previously had occasion to develop. But it is in the acoustic landscape of their changing world that perhaps the most intriguing developments reveal themselves. Subtle alterations in the way sound travels through air that has grown thinner and more transparent to frequencies that had previously been absorbed or deflected by atmospheric conditions evolved for a different climate regime. Thomas has begun to detect what seem to be long-distance communications between creatures separated by distances that would normally prevent any direct contact. Low-frequency calls that travel farther than the terrain should allow, suggesting that atmospheric changes may be creating acoustic corridors that connect habitats and populations in ways that could fundamentally alter the social and reproductive patterns of species that had evolved their behaviors under very different environmental constraints. The temperature patterns that govern daily and seasonal rhythms continue to follow curves that speak of influences operating on multiple timescales simultaneously, immediate responses to local weather conditions overlaid with longer trends that suggest connections to planetary processes that operate according to schedules measured in thousands and millions of years, rather than the brief cycles that individual organisms experience as the normal rhythm of their lives. The warmth that rises from the Earth each morning carries within it the accumulated energy of countless seasons, while the coolness that settles each evening seems to draw from reserves of chill that may have been building in the deep places where surface changes register only after long delays that allow underground systems time to adjust their operations to accommodate new inputs and requirements. The way water moves through this landscape has begun to follow patterns that suggest not just seasonal variation but systematic reorganization of the underground networks that carry moisture from its sources in distant mountains to the springs and streams that support local ecosystems, changes that may be preparing the groundwater systems for conditions that require more efficient distribution of increasingly precious resources. Margaret has traced the subtle alterations in mineral content that speak of water spending longer periods in contact with deeper rock formations, drawing different combinations of dissolved substances that may be essential for maintaining the chemical balances that allow the complex partnerships between plants and soil organisms to continue their patient work of building and maintaining the living foundation upon which all surface life depends. Yet perhaps the most significant revelation emerges from the growing recognition that these changes may not represent responses to external pressures, but rather the expression of internal processes that operate according to their own intrinsic rhythms, transformations that arise from the accumulated consequences of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation reaching some natural culmination that requires new organizational principles to accommodate forms of life that had never previously been possible under Earth's earlier atmospheric and climatic regimes. The very air they breathe seems to vibrate with possibilities that hover just beyond the threshold of actualization, potential developments that await only the proper combination of circumstances to transform themselves from abstract possibility into concrete reality. Thomas and Margaret find themselves spending longer periods in contemplative silence, not because their observations have become less interesting, but because the patterns they reveal seem to require forms of understanding that operate below the level of conscious analysis, insights that emerge only when the mind allows itself to perceive relationships that exist between rather than within the discrete phenomena that careful observation can document and measure. Their journals have evolved from records of specific sightings and measurements into attempts to capture the quality of interconnection that seems to flow through all the changes they witness. A sense that every local alteration participates in transformations that encompass not just this particular landscape but the entire planetary system of which it forms one small but integral component. The evening light that illuminates their shared contemplations carries within it the accumulated radiance of countless sunsets. But now that light seems to fall through space that offers less resistance to its passage, creating visual effects that make familiar landscapes appear both more vivid and more ethereal, as though the solid world they thought they knew has begun to reveal its underlying nature as patterns of energy and information that take temporary form in configurations we experience as rocks and trees and flowing water. The shadows that pool in the valleys below their observation point seem deeper and more mysterious, not because they hide more darkness, but because they suggest spaces where transformations too subtle for direct observation may be preparing to emerge into the clear light of day. But as they sit together in the gathering dusk, watching stars emerge in air so clear it seems like crystal, Thomas and Margaret sense that they stand at the threshold of understanding something that will change not just their knowledge of this ancient world, but their conception of what becomes possible when a planet reaches the particular stage of its development that allows entirely new experiments in organization and consciousness to begin their long exploration of previously unimaginable forms of existence. And in the perfect stillness of night air that carries no sound except the distant murmur of water finding new pathways through landscapes that may be preparing to dream entirely different dreams, they wait. The piece introduces fresh curiosity through these discoveries, while maintaining that feeling of being close to but still distant from the full answer. And as Thomas and Margaret wait in the crystal-clear night air, sensing they're on the verge of understanding something transformational, their quiet vigil is shared across this ancient landscape by others who have found themselves drawn to witness the subtle but persistent changes that seem to flow like slow rivers through every aspect of the world they thought they knew. In the valleys that stretch eastward toward what might one day be called Whitmore, a patient observer named Samuel has established his own watching place beside a spring that bubbles up from limestone depths, its waters carrying mineral signatures that speak of underground journeys through rock formations laid down when this entire region existed beneath warm, shallow seas that teemed with creatures whose shells now form the foundation stones of hills and ridges that rise like sleeping giants. Above the current landscape, Samuel's attention focuses on the way water emerges from the earth with temperatures and chemical compositions that vary according to rhythms he cannot yet decode. Cycles that seem to respond to influences as immediate as daily weather patterns and as distant as the slow movements of underground rivers that may connect his isolated spring to water sources hundreds of miles away, creating networks of liquid communication that carry information between regions that appear completely separate when viewed only from the surface. His notes, carved into soft bark with tools shaped from harder wood, record the subtle changes in flow rate and mineral content that suggest underground systems reorganizing themselves in response to pressures that build so gradually that their effects become visible only to someone who has learned to measure change in increments so small that seasons pass between one noticeable alteration and the next. But Samuel's observations reveal patterns that echo the discoveries that Thomas and Margaret have made in their own locations, suggesting that the changes they witness may be expressions of processes that operate across vast distances, connecting landscapes that seem isolated but that may participate in transformations too large for any single observer to encompass. The spring water that Samuel tastes each morning carries flavors that speak of contact with rock layers that hold within their mineral structure the memory of atmospheric conditions that existed millions of years before any current form of life had evolved the ability to witness the slow dance between earth and sky that shapes every aspect of the environment in which consciousness finds itself embedded. Water connects all their observations in ways that become more apparent as the weeks pass, and the subtle but persistent changes they document begin to reveal their underlying unity. The streams that flow past Oxford and Meadowbrook joining with countless other waterways that carry the accumulated stories of transformation across distances that span continents, each tributary adding its own chemical signature to the great circulation that links mountain springs to valley pools to the vast, oceanic systems that regulate planetary climate according to schedules that encompass not just seasons and years, but the entire history of life's experimentation with different ways of being alive. Margaret often traces with her finger the routes that water might follow from her observation point to the sea, imagining the conversations between land and ocean that occur as fresh water carries its cargo of dissolved minerals and organic compounds into salt water that has been accumulating its own chemical memories for billions of years. In the highlands that rise beyond Whitmore, where the wind moves through stands of primitive conifers with a sound like distant music, another observer named Eleanor has made her camp beside an outcrop of red stone that bears the fossilized remains of creatures that lived when the Earth's atmosphere contained different proportions of the gases that current life depends upon for survival. The rock formations that surround her temporary shelter tell stories of multiple episodes when sea levels rose to cover these elevated regions, depositing layers of sediment that preserved in their mineral matrix the shells and bones of organisms that thrived under conditions so different from current circumstances that their fossilized remains seem like messages from another planet entirely. Eleanor's discoveries parallel those that Thomas has made near Oxford, revealing traces of locomotion patterns that suggest experiments in movement and posture that may have been testing the advantages of carrying body weight in configurations that no previous generation of land animals had attempted. Innovations that required not just anatomical changes, but entirely new forms of neural control that could coordinate the complex balance adjustments necessary for maintaining stability while moving the center of gravity to positions that offered greater efficiency in locomotion, but that also demanded greater precision in muscular coordination. Her sketches of fossilized trackways show creatures that seem to be exploring the possibility of holding their bodies higher above the ground, developing gaits that transferred weight from sprawling limbs to more vertically oriented leg structures that could support larger body sizes while requiring less energy for movement across varied terrain. The wind that moves through Eleanor's highland camp carries scents and sounds from distant regions, connecting her isolated observation post to the great atmospheric circulation that links every location on the planet's surface to every other location through currents of air that transport not just moisture and temperature but chemical signals that may allow widely separated ecosystems to share information about environmental changes that affect the entire biosphere. She has noticed that certain wind patterns seem to carry particular combinations of scents that appear only during specific phases of the moon or at particular times of day, suggesting that atmospheric circulation may be responding to astronomical influences that operate according to schedules too vast for individual consciousness to perceive directly, but that nonetheless leave their traces in the quality of air that fills the lungs of every breathing creature. The stars that illuminate Eleanor's highland vigils shine with a clarity that speaks of atmospheric conditions growing increasingly transparent to wavelengths that had previously been filtered out by moisture and particulates that once gave the night sky a softer, more diffuse quality. creating viewing conditions that allow her to see celestial details that may not have been visible from Earth's surface for millions of years. These enhanced astronomical observations reveal patterns of stellar movement and planetary alignment that suggest cycles operating on timescales that encompass not just individual lifetimes, but the entire duration of species, and the longer rhythms that govern the rise and fall of different experiments in biological organization. Connections between terrestrial and cosmic processes that may influence the timing of evolutionary innovations in ways that current understanding has not yet learned to recognize. But perhaps the most significant connections between these separate observations emerge from the recognition that all three observers have begun to document changes in the behavior of creatures that suggest responses to environmental pressures that may be pushing various species toward critical thresholds beyond which entirely new forms of adaptation become not just advantageous but necessary for survival in a world that may be approaching conditions unprecedented in the history of complex life on Earth. Samuel's notes record alterations in the daily routines of animals that visit his spring, behavioral modifications that suggest these creatures may be preparing for circumstances that have not yet fully manifested but that require forms of cooperation and resource sharing that transcend normal territorial boundaries and species-specific survival strategies. Eleanor's highland observations reveal similar patterns among the creatures that move through the conifer forests, animals that seem to be developing enhanced sensitivity to environmental changes that operate on multiple timescales simultaneously, immediate responses to daily weather variations overlaid with longer-term adjustments that suggest awareness of seasonal and annual trends that may be building toward configurations that no current generation of living things has previously encountered. The tracks she finds in the soft earth around her camp show creatures moving in formations that suggest coordination across species boundaries, sharing routes and timing that may represent experiments in collective survival strategies that individual species had never previously had occasion to develop. Stone carries its own messages between these separated observers. The rock formations that anchor each of their camps, connected by geological processes that operate according to timescales measured in millions of years, creating underground networks of mineral exchange and pressure distribution that link mountain highlands to valley springs to coastal plains in patterns of slow communication that carry information about planetary changes too vast for surface observation to detect directly. The fossils that Eleanor finds in her highland rocks speak of creatures that lived when these elevated regions existed at sea level, while the limestone that feeds Samuel's spring preserves the shells of organisms that thrived in shallow marine environments that covered regions now hundreds of miles inland, suggesting that the solid Earth itself participates in transformations that relocate continents and ocean basins according to schedules that make the brief experiments of biological evolution seem like momentary fluctuations in processes that reshape the entire planetary surface. The quality of light that illuminates all their observations carries within it the accumulated radiance of a star that has burned steadily for billions of years. But that light now falls through atmospheric conditions that seem to be approaching configurations not experienced since the early phases of Earth's development, when different combinations of gases created chemical environments that allowed entirely different forms of life to explore possibilities that subsequent atmospheric evolution had rendered impossible until changes now underway began to recreate conditions that might once again support innovations in biological organization that had been waiting in the realm of unrealized potential for circumstances favorable to their actualization. Water, wind, stone, and stars connect their separate vigils in networks of influence that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, but that nonetheless shape every aspect of the observations they make and the patterns they detect in the slow dance of transformation that seems to encompass every level of organization from individual organisms to planetary systems, creating a sense that their scattered locations participate in a single vast experiment that may be approaching some critical threshold beyond which entirely new forms of existence become not just possible but inevitable. And as each observer sits in contemplative silence beside their particular manifestation of the changes that flow like slow music through every aspect of the world they thought they understood, they sense that their individual discoveries form fragments of a larger pattern that may be revealing itself to anyone patient enough to learn the deep languages that Earth uses to announce the approach of innovations in consciousness and organization that could reshape the entire future of life's exploration of what becomes possible when matter learns to think, and when thinking learns to dream of possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of what any previous form of awareness had imagined could ever become real. The rhythm stays calm and contemplative, showing how these separate vigils are part of one vast experiment in biological organization. And as Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, and Eleanor continue their patient observations from their scattered positions across this ancient landscape, the patterns they document begin to suggest interpretations that stretch the boundaries of what any single explanation could encompass, possibilities that hover like morning mist around the edges of understanding, each potential answer revealing new questions that ripple outward like waves from stones dropped into still water. Perhaps what they witness represents the slow culmination of millions of years of atmospheric change, the Earth's vast respiratory system adjusting to new balances between the gases that support different forms of life, oxygen concentrations that may be approaching levels that could support larger body sizes and more energetic metabolisms than previous atmospheric conditions had allowed, creating opportunities for evolutionary experiments that had been waiting in the realm of possibility for chemistry to provide the proper foundation for their exploration. Margaret finds herself wondering if the changes in water flow and mineral content that she measures each day might signal shifts in the planet's internal heat distribution. Deep geological processes that move like slow thoughts through rock formations that connect surface springs to magma chambers that pulse with rhythms measured in millions of years, underground conversations between solid and liquid phases of matter that may be preparing to redistribute the energy that drives weather patterns, and ocean currents according to configurations that could fundamentally alter the climate zones within which different forms of life have learned to thrive. The limestone that feeds Samuel's spring preserves in its crystalline structure the accumulated shells of countless creatures that lived when this region existed beneath warm seas. But those ancient marine environments may have supported chemical balances that current atmospheric conditions cannot maintain, suggesting that the changes they observe might represent the planet's attempt to recreate oceanic chemistry that could once again support the complex partnerships between different forms of life that thrived under earlier atmospheric regimes. But perhaps the alterations they document speak of influences that reach beyond purely terrestrial processes, celestial mechanics that operate according to schedules so vast that individual consciousness can perceive their effects only as gradual trends that accumulate across geological ages, the slow dance of planets and moons creating gravitational rhythms that may influence the circulation of atmosphere and ocean in ways that terrestrial observation cannot directly detect, but that, nonetheless, shape the conditions within which biological evolution conducts its patient experiments with different organizational possibilities. Eleanor's Highland observations reveal astronomical viewing conditions that suggest atmospheric transparency approaching levels not experienced for millions of years, clarity that may result from reduced moisture content that could be part of larger climatic shifts driven by the planet's changing relationship to solar radiation as orbital parameters follow their vast cycles through configurations that bring different amounts and qualities of energy to different regions of the Earth's surface. The trackways that Thomas sketches near Oxford and that Eleanor documents in her Highland camp may represent responses to gravitational changes so subtle that only the most sensitive biological systems could detect them, alterations in the planet's rotational dynamics that might affect the energy required for different forms of locomotion, making previously disadvantageous postures and gaits suddenly more efficient under new physical conditions that favor creatures capable of carrying their body weight in configurations that minimize the work required to move across landscapes that may themselves be adjusting to modified gravitational relationships with the moon and sun. The precise timing that Samuel observes in the flow patterns of his spring might reflect tidal influences that operate not just in ocean basins, but in underground water systems that respond to astronomical cycles too complex for surface observation to decode, suggesting that the changes they witness participate in rhythms that encompass the entire solar system. Thomas often contemplates the possibility that what they observe might represent not environmental change but evolutionary innovation. Life forms that have reached some critical threshold in their exploration of different ways of organizing matter and energy. Creatures that may be developing entirely new relationships with their physical environment through innovations in neural organization that allow more sophisticated responses to environmental complexity. Consciousness that could be learning to perceive and respond to patterns that operate on multiple timescales simultaneously. Awareness that bridges the gap between immediate sensory experience and the vast rhythms that govern planetary and astronomical processes. The enhanced cooperation that all four observers note among creatures that normally maintain strict territorial boundaries, might signal the emergence of collective intelligence that transcends individual species limitations, communication systems that allow different forms of life to share information about environmental changes in ways that create effective responses to challenges that no single organism could address through individual adaptation alone. Margaret's measurements of mineral concentration in her slowly dropping stream reveal chemical signatures that might indicate not just changing water sources but fundamental alterations in the way living systems process and exchange the materials they require for growth and reproduction. Metabolic innovations that could be preparing various species for environmental conditions that will require more efficient utilization of resources that may become less abundant as climatic changes progress toward new equilibrium states. The complex partnerships between plants and soil organisms that she documents through her careful excavations around root systems might represent experiments in resource sharing that transcend normal competitive relationships, cooperation that could be essential for survival in a world where traditional strategies for acquiring nutrients and moisture may no longer provide adequate support for the energy requirements of increasingly complex life forms. But the changes they witness might also represent something entirely unprecedented in the history of Earth's biological experiments, the first stirrings of forms of organization that bridge the gap between living and non-living systems, partnerships between biological and geological processes that could create hybrid forms of existence that participate simultaneously in the rapid timescales that govern individual organisms and the vast timescales that govern planetary evolution, consciousness that extends beyond the boundaries of individual bodies to include awareness of the rock and soil and atmospheric systems that support and sustain all biological activity. Samuel's observations of underground water networks suggest communication systems that operate through chemical gradients and pressure waves that travel at speeds that allow information exchange between regions separated by hundreds of miles, creating the possibility that individual springs and streams participate in a form of distributed awareness that encompasses entire watersheds, and that could be developing the ability to coordinate responses to environmental changes across scales that individual organisms cannot directly perceive. Eleanor's documentation of fossilized remains that show evidence of locomotion experiments suggests that previous episodes in Earth's history may have witnessed similar periods of innovation. Times when environmental conditions approached thresholds that triggered rapid evolutionary responses that produced entirely new forms of organization, waves of innovation that swept across the planet's surface like incoming tides that carry seeds of change to every shore they touch, leaving behind traces of experimentation that become visible only to observers who learn to read the patient script that time writes in stone and mineral, and the preserved remains of creatures that tested possibilities that subsequent environmental changes rendered impossible until conditions once again became favorable for their exploration. The patterns she traces in highland rock formations reveal cycles within cycles, rhythms of change that operate on timescales so vast that they encompass multiple episodes of biological innovation, suggesting that what they currently witness might represent one phase in an ongoing conversation between Earth and life that follows schedules measured not in years or centuries, but in the rise and fall of mountain ranges and the drift of continents across the planetary surface. The quality of light that illuminates all their observations carries within it information about atmospheric changes that could be preparing the planet for entirely new relationships between electromagnetic radiation and the chemical processes that support life, conditions that might allow photosynthesis to operate with greater efficiency or that could support new forms of energy capture that bridge the gap between purely biological and purely physical systems, partnerships between living tissue and crystalline structures that could create hybrid organisms capable of processing solar energy in ways that current forms of life cannot access. The enhanced visual clarity that all four observers note might result from atmospheric conditions that approach the transparency that existed during earlier phases of planetary development, when different combinations of gases created environmental conditions that supported forms of life that operated according to principles that subsequent atmospheric evolution had rendered obsolete until current changes began to recreate the chemical foundations that such organisms require for their particular experiments with consciousness and organization. Water connects their separate discoveries through networks of circulation that operate on every scale from local watersheds to global oceanic systems, carrying chemical messages that link the underground springs that Samuel monitors to the streams that flow past Thomas and Margaret's observation points to the highland sources that feed Eleanor's elevated camp, creating pathways for information exchange that could be essential for coordinating the responses that different regions require to accommodate changes that affect the entire planetary system simultaneously. The mineral signatures that each observer detects in their local water sources might represent reports from distant regions where different aspects of the transformation process are most advanced. Early warning systems that allow ecosystems to prepare for conditions that have not yet arrived, but that may be approaching according to schedules that operate beyond the normal time horizons of biological planning and adaptation. But perhaps the most profound possibility that emerges from their accumulated observations is that they may be witnessing the planet's preparation for forms of life that do not yet exist, environmental conditions that could support innovations in consciousness and organization that exceed the boundaries of what current biological evolution has achieved, partnerships between matter and awareness that could create new categories of existence that bridge the gap between the purely physical and the purely mental, experiments in organization that could transform the entire future trajectory of evolution's exploration of what becomes possible when the universe develops the capacity to contemplate itself through forms of awareness that transcend the limitations of individual organisms while remaining grounded in the physical processes that connect all manifestations of consciousness to the vast systems of energy and matter that sustain every aspect of existence. And as they sit in contemplative silence beneath stars that shine through air so clear it seems like crystallized space, each observer wonders whether the changes they document with such patient attention might be preparing the Earth for the emergence of awareness so different from their own that the very categories they use to distinguish between observer and observed, between consciousness and environment, between individual and planetary processes, might dissolve into new forms of understanding that operate according to principles that current thinking cannot yet imagine, but that their careful observations may be helping to midwife into existence through the simple act of paying attention to transformations too subtle and too vast for hurried consciousness to perceive, leaving them with the quiet question of whether their own awareness might be participating in the very changes they seek to understand. The piece balances grounded scientific ideas with more expansive what-ifs about consciousness bridging individual and planetary scales. And as the night air grows softer around their scattered observation points, Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, and Eleanor find themselves settling into the kind of quiet rhythm that emerges when the urgent need to understand gives way to the deeper satisfaction of simply being present with mystery, their footsteps growing slower as they move through landscapes that seem to pulse with patient secrets, each observer carrying within their careful attention the accumulated weight of all the small moments that have shaped their understanding of what it means to witness change so vast and so subtle that it requires a different kind of seeing, a different relationship with time itself. The lamps they light beside their evening camps cast warm circles of illumination that seem to hold space for contemplation, flickering flames that dance with the same gentle persistence that characterizes everything they have learned to value about the slow work of observation, light that creates intimate spaces within the vast darkness where individual consciousness can rest without feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the processes they have dedicated themselves to documenting with such tender precision. Margaret often finds herself tracing with soft hands the maps she has drawn on bark paper pages, her fingertips following the careful lines that chart the gradual changes in water flow and mineral content, each mark representing hours of patient measurement, days of returning to the same observation points to record variations so small that only the most dedicated attention could detect them, and in this gentle repetition of familiar routes across surfaces made precious by careful use, she discovers something about the nature of care itself, the way that sustained attention transforms both observer and observed, creating relationships that transcend the simple gathering of information to become forms of communion with processes that operate on scales so different from human experience that they require entirely new vocabularies of respect and wonder. The still water that pools in her favorite observation spots reflects not just the sky but the quality of attention she brings to each moment of measurement, creating mirrors that seem to hold her careful gaze and return it transformed by contact with depths that speak of underground journeys through limestone chambers where time moves according to different rules than those that govern surface experience. Thomas has developed the habit of walking the same paths each evening, his footsteps finding their way through familiar terrain with the kind of automatic grace that emerges when body and landscape have learned to recognize each other, his routes becoming forms of meditation that connect present observation to the accumulated memory of all his previous encounters with the creatures and plants that share this ancient world. The maps he keeps in his weather journal record not just locations and measurements but the emotional landscape of discovery, notes about the quality of light on particular mornings, sketches that capture the way shadows fell across trackways that revealed new information about locomotion experiments that may be testing the possibilities for entirely different relationships between body and earth. His soft hands trace these recorded observations with the same gentle attention that he brings to handling the mineral samples he collects, each specimen requiring its own form of care, its own patient examination that respects the millions of years of accumulated experience held within crystalline structures that speak of pressures and temperatures and chemical conversations that individual consciousness can appreciate only through the kind of sustained wondering that transforms scientific observation into something approaching reverence. Samuel's vigil beside his spring has become a form of prayer without words, hours spent in motionless attention beside water that bubbles up from depths that connect his isolated observation point to vast underground networks that carry chemical messages across distances that span continents. His presence beside this ancient source teaching him something about the relationship between individual awareness and planetary processes that operate according to schedules too vast for personal experience to encompass directly, but that nonetheless invite forms of participation that transcend the normal boundaries between observer and observed. The warm night air that moves across his camp carries scents that speak of transformations occurring in regions he will never visit, but that nonetheless shape the quality of each breath he draws, connecting his individual existence to atmospheric circulation patterns that link every living thing to every other living thing through networks of exchange too complex for conscious thought to map, but simple enough for bodies to navigate with the kind of automatic wisdom that operates below the threshold of deliberate planning. Eleanor's Highland Camp has become a sanctuary where the work of observation merges with the deeper satisfaction of simply being present within landscapes that seem to invite contemplation, her elevated position providing perspectives that encompass not just the immediate terrain but the vast distances that connect mountain highlands to valley springs to coastal plains where other forms of life conduct their own experiments with adaptation and survival under changing environmental conditions. Her lamps burn each evening like beacons that mark not destinations but way stations in journeys that have no fixed endpoints, points of warmth and stability within processes of change that operate on scales so vast that individual consciousness can participate in them only through the kind of patient attention that allows momentary awareness to align itself with rhythms that encompass geological ages and astronomical cycles that make personal timeframes seem like the brief flutter of leaves in evening breezes that carry news from regions where different aspects of planetary transformation reveal themselves to other observers who share the commitment to witnessing change with the kind of care that honors both its magnitude and its subtlety. But perhaps the deepest lesson that emerges from their accumulated months of careful watching lies not in any specific discovery, but in what their sustained attention teaches about the nature of patience itself, the way that genuine understanding requires forms of relationship with time that modern urgency rarely allows, connections to processes that unfold according to their own intrinsic rhythms rather than the schedules that human planning attempts to impose upon experiences that exceed the boundaries of individual control or comprehension. Margaret's daily measurements of stream flow have taught her something about the relationship between consistency and variation, the way that reliable attention to small changes creates the foundation for recognizing larger patterns that emerge only when observation continues long enough for cycles within cycles to reveal their underlying structure, relationships that become visible only to awareness that has learned to operate with the kind of temporal patience that allows individual moments to accumulate into something approaching wisdom about the nature of change itself. Thomas's careful documentation of creature behavior reveals similar insights about the relationship between immediate observation and accumulated understanding, the way that individual sightings gain meaning only when they become part of larger narratives that span seasons and years, stories that emerge from the patient work of returning again and again to the same observation points with the same quality of attention, creating through repetition and consistency the kind of relationship with particular places and creatures that transcends simple data collection to become forms of interspecies communication that operate through presence and attention rather than words or deliberate signals. His sketches of trackways and movement patterns capture not just anatomical details but something about the quality of relationship that develops when human consciousness learns to align itself with the rhythms of other forms of awareness, creating space for forms of understanding that emerge from sustained contact rather than analytical distance. Samuel's Springside meditations have revealed something about the nature of memory itself, the way that water carries within its molecular structure the accumulated history of all the landscapes it has touched, all the rock formations it has dissolved grain by microscopic grain, all the root systems that have drawn sustenance from its passing presence, creating forms of liquid memory that connect present experience to geological processes that span millions of years, but that nonetheless influence the taste and temperature and mineral content of each sip of water that touches individual lips and connects personal hydration to planetary circulation systems that encompass every scale from cellular to oceanic. His patient attention to the subtle variations in flow rate and chemical composition teaches something about the relationship between immediate experience and vast temporal processes, the way that careful attention to present-moment details can become a form of communion with timescales that individual consciousness cannot directly encompass, but that nonetheless shape every aspect of the conditions within which awareness finds itself embedded. Eleanor's Highland observations from her elevated perspective provide insights into the relationship between individual position and comprehensive understanding. The way that sustained attention from any particular location eventually reveals connections to processes that operate far beyond the immediate horizon, networks of relationship that link local observations to planetary systems through pathways of influence that become visible only to awareness that has learned to perceive patterns that operate on multiple scales simultaneously. Her maps of wind patterns and atmospheric clarity connect her isolated camp to global circulation systems that carry information between regions through channels that transcend the normal boundaries between separate locations, creating forms of atmospheric communication that allow different ecosystems to share responses to environmental changes that affect the entire planetary system, but that manifest differently in different regions according to local conditions that nonetheless participate in global patterns of transformation. The warm light of their evening lamps creates spaces where individual consciousness can rest within processes too vast for complete comprehension, islands of human-scale illumination within darkness that speaks of depths and distances that exceed the boundaries of personal experience, but that nonetheless invite forms of participation that honor both the magnitude of planetary processes and the intimate scale of individual attention to detail. Their careful notes and sketches and measurements become forms of offering, gifts of attention given to processes that exceed any possibility of reciprocal recognition, but that nonetheless seem to respond to the quality of care that sustained observation represents, creating relationships between human awareness and geological time that operate through presence and patience rather than expectation or demand for specific outcomes or revelations. Memory accumulates around their observation points like sediment around stones in slow-moving streams, layers of recalled experience that create depth and richness in present-moment awareness, each return to familiar locations bringing not just new information but enhanced appreciation for the complex relationships between consistency and variation that characterize all the processes they have dedicated themselves to witnessing with such gentle persistence. Their soft hands hold journals that have become repositories of accumulated wonder, pages that record not just measurements and observations, but the emotional landscape of discovery. The way that sustained attention to small changes teaches something about the nature of care itself, the relationship between individual consciousness and planetary processes that exceed personal comprehension, but that nonetheless invite forms of participation that transform both observer and observed through the simple act of paying attention with the kind of patience that honors mystery rather than demanding its immediate resolution. Still water reflects not just images, but the quality of attention that individual awareness brings to each moment of contact with processes that operate according to their own intrinsic rhythms, creating mirrors that seem to hold and return the careful gaze that seeks not to solve but to appreciate the depth and complexity of relationships between consciousness and environment that transcend the normal boundaries between subject and object, observer and observed, human awareness and planetary. Systems that encompass every scale from molecular to astronomical, but that nonetheless invite forms of intimate participation through the patient work of sustained attention to details so small and changes so gradual that they require entirely new relationships with time itself, new forms of temporal patience that allow individual moments to accumulate into something approaching communion with processes that exceed personal comprehension, but that nonetheless welcome the kind of careful presence that these four observers have learned to offer to a world that seems poised on the threshold of transformations too subtle and too vast for hurried consciousness to perceive, but that nonetheless reveal themselves to awareness that has learned to rest inside mystery rather than demanding its immediate solution. The writing emphasizes the quality of care and presence that the observers bring to their work, suggesting that this form of attention is itself a way of participating in the vast processes they seek to understand. And as the final hours of night settle like a gentle blanket across the ancient landscape where Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, and Eleanor have maintained their patient vigils, the accumulated weight of all their careful observations begins to resolve into something that feels less like answers and more like a deeper appreciation for the questions themselves. The way that sustained attention to mystery transforms the very nature of wondering from an urgent demand for solutions into a form of communion with processes that exceed individual comprehension, but that nonetheless welcome the kind of tender presence that these four observers have learned to offer to a world poised on the threshold of changes too subtle and too vast for hurried consciousness to perceive. The candles that have illuminated their evening note-taking begin to burn lower, their flames settling into the steady rhythm that comes when wax has found its perfect balance with air, creating pools of warm light that seem to hold space for the kind of reflection that emerges only when the day's discoveries have had time to settle into the deeper layers of understanding, where immediate observation meets accumulated wisdom and transforms both into something approaching reverence for the patience that geological time requires from any consciousness that seeks to participate in its vast rhythms. Thomas finds himself walking one final circuit of the paths that have become as familiar as the lines on his own palms. His footsteps finding their way through darkness with the automatic grace that develops when body and landscape have learned to recognize each other through months of careful attention. His route taking him past all the observation points where he has documented changes in creature behavior and soil composition and the subtle alterations in the quality of light that may signal atmospheric transformations approaching thresholds that could support entirely new experiments in biological organization. His weathered journal rests secure in the pocket closest to his heart, its pages filled with sketches of trackways that suggest locomotion experiments and notes about the wanderer's gradually changing posture and measurements of mineral samples that speak of underground processes operating on scales that connect his local observations to planetary systems too vast for individual consciousness to encompass directly, but that nonetheless invite participation through the simple act of paying attention with the kind of consistency that honors both immediate detail and vast temporal context. Margaret sits beside her red sandstone boulder for what may be the last time. Her bark paper charts spread before her in arrangements that create maps of change spanning months of careful measurement, each mark representing hours of patient observation beside the stream that has taught her something about the relationship between surface phenomena and underground networks that connect her isolated valley to water sources that carry chemical messages across distances measured in hundreds of miles. Stories written in dissolved minerals and temperature variations that speak of springs drawing from reserves that may be adjusting their circulation patterns in response to atmospheric changes that affect the entire planetary system simultaneously. Her soft hands trace the patterns her measurements have revealed, cycles within cycles that suggest influences operating on timescales from daily weather to geological ages, connections between local observation and global processes that become visible only to awareness that has learned to perceive relationships that transcend the normal boundaries between separate phenomena and reveal the underlying unity that links every measurement to every other measurement through networks of causation. 2. Complex for analytical thought to map, but simple enough for patient attention to appreciate. Samuel's vigil beside his spring has reached a natural conclusion, the accumulated months of observation revealing patterns in flow rate and mineral content that speak of underground circulation systems responding to influences that reach from immediate weather to astronomical cycles. His notes carved into soft bark, creating records of chemical variations that connect his isolated observation point to vast networks of liquid communication that carry information between regions through pathways that operate below the surface of visible geography, but that nonetheless shape every aspect of the conditions that support surface life. The warm night air that moves across his camp carries scents that speak of transformations occurring in distant regions, atmospheric circulation that links his individual breathing to planetary respiratory systems that encompass every scale from local weather to global climate patterns that may be approaching configurations not experienced for millions of years, creating opportunities for innovations in biological organization that had been waiting in the realm of unrealized possibility for environmental conditions favorable to their exploration. Eleanor's Highland Camp provides a final perspective that encompasses not just immediate terrain, but the vast distances that connect mountain springs to valley streams to coastal plains where other forms of life conduct their own experiments with adaptation under changing conditions. Her elevated position offering views that reveal the interconnected nature of all the observations that she and her distant companions have made across this ancient landscape, connections that become visible only to Awareness that has learned to perceive patterns operating on multiple scales simultaneously, relationships between individual creatures and planetary processes that transcend normal categories of analysis and invite forms of understanding that emerge from sustained contact rather than theoretical distance. Her maps of atmospheric clarity and wind patterns connect local observation to global circulation systems, creating visual representations of the networks that link every observation point to every other observation point through pathways of influence that operate beyond the normal boundaries of geographical separation. But perhaps the deepest insight that emerges from their accumulated observations lies not in any specific discovery about the nature of the changes they have witnessed, but in what their sustained attention has revealed about the relationship between individual consciousness and the vast processes within which all awareness finds itself embedded. The way that patient observation creates forms of participation that transcend the normal boundaries between observer and observed and allow temporary alignment between human timescales and geological rhythms that operate according to schedules measured in millions of years rather than individual lifespans. Their careful documentation of small changes has become a form of offering gifts of attention given to processes that exceed any possibility of direct reciprocal recognition, but that nonetheless seem to welcome the quality of care that sustained observation represents, creating relationships between consciousness and environment that honor both the magnitude of planetary systems and the intimate scale of individual attention to detail. The questions that drew them to their respective observation points remain largely unanswered, but those questions have transformed through sustained contact with mystery from urgent demands for specific information into appreciations for the depth and complexity of processes that may be approaching innovations in biological organization that exceed the boundaries of what previous forms of life had achieved, experiments in consciousness and cooperation that could reshape the entire future. Trajectory of evolution's exploration of what becomes possible when matter develops the capacity to contemplate itself through forms of awareness that transcend individual limitation while remaining grounded in the physical processes that connect all manifestations of life to the geological and atmospheric systems that provide the foundation for every experiment in existence. Their notebooks and sketches and measurements preserve not just data but the emotional landscape of discovery. Records of what it feels like to witness change so vast and so subtle that it requires entirely new relationships with patience and time, and the kind of wondering that honors mystery rather than demanding its immediate resolution. The tide of their attention begins to ebb like water flowing back towards sources that lie beyond the horizon of immediate experience, carrying with it the accumulated sediment of all their careful observations, leaving behind not answers but enhanced appreciation for questions that may be too large for any individual consciousness to encompass fully, but that nonetheless invite forms of participation that transform both questioner and questioned through the simple act of sustained presence. Within, processes that exceed personal comprehension but that welcome the kind of patient attention that these four observers have learned to offer. Their scattered vigils across this ancient landscape have created a network of witness that may be one small part of the Earth's own preparation for changes that approach according to schedules that operate beyond human planning, but that nonetheless seem to benefit from the quality of careful observation that dedicated consciousness can provide to transformations too subtle for hurried awareness to detect. As the last flames of their evening candles settle into the steady burning that precedes their gentle extinction, each observer finds themselves surrounded by the kind of silence that emerges when urgent questioning gives way to peaceful appreciation for the ongoing nature of mystery itself. The way that genuine understanding creates space for deeper wondering rather than final conclusions, opening rather than closing the relationship between consciousness and the processes within which all awareness finds itself embedded like temporary eddies in currents too vast to see from any single perspective, but that nonetheless welcome participation through the patient work of paying attention to details so small and changes so gradual that they reveal themselves only to awareness that has learned to rest inside uncertainty rather than demanding immediate resolution. The wide sky that stretches above their scattered camps holds within its star-filled darkness the same patient vastness that characterizes all the processes they have dedicated themselves to witnessing, spaces between points of light that speak of distances and time scales that dwarf individual experience, but that nonetheless invite forms of communion that honor both cosmic magnitude and intimate detail, creating sanctuary for the kind of contemplation that emerges when temporary consciousness aligns itself with eternal processes and discovers in that alignment not answers but enhanced capacity for wondering about relationships between awareness and environment that transcend normal categories of understanding, and reveal possibilities for participation that transform the very nature of what it means to be conscious within a universe that seems designed to reward patient attention with glimpses of beauty and complexity that exceed any single perspective but that nonetheless welcome. The quality of careful presence that sustained observation represents. The final breath of night air carries within it the accumulated essence of all the transformations they have witnessed. Change is so gradual that individual moments of observation reveal their significance only when accumulated across months of patient attention, creating through consistency and care the kind of temporal depth that allows consciousness to perceive patterns that operate on scales from molecular to planetary, relationships that become visible only to awareness that has learned to inhabit mystery rather than solving it, participating in processes that exceed individual comprehension, but that nonetheless invite the kind of tender presence that honors both the magnitude of geological time and the intimacy of each careful measurement, each gentle sketch, each moment of wondering attention offered to a world that seems poised on the threshold of innovations in organization and consciousness that could reshape the entire future of what becomes possible when the universe develops the capacity to contemplate itself through forms of awareness patient enough to align themselves with rhythms that encompass the rise and fall of mountains and the slow dance of continents across the face of a planet that breathes with tides of change measured in millions of years, but that nonetheless welcomes participation through the simple act of sustained attention to the beauty and complexity that surrounds every moment of conscious experience within the vast, patient, star-filled darkness that holds all questions and all possibilities within its gentle, eternal embrace.